Hello and welcome to this pre-recorded webinar where we'll be looking at the trade barriers for red meat under various Brexit scenarios. My name is Luke Crossman and I'm a senior analyst working in the Market Intelligence Department of AHDB. With the current uncertain political landscape, it's important to understand what factors affect trade and their impact to prices and outputs. To do this, AHDB, QMS and HCC commissioned the Anderson Centre to study the current trade situation and look at potential impacts of a deal and no-deal Brexit. In this webinar, we'll be going through the key aspects of that study, which is available as a report on the website, and there's more on that later. To take you through this webinar, I'm joined by the author of the report, Michael Haverty. Michael is a partner with the Anderson Centre, coming from a livestock farming background. He has worked on numerous Brexit-related projects in recent years, including studies on the impact of no-deal Brexit on the Northern Ireland beef and sheep meat industry, assessments on non-tariff barriers across a range of agri-food sectors, and studies on agricultural and labour policy. So without further delay, Michael, over to you.
Hello, thank you very much, Luke. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. During the webinar here today, just going to firstly give an overview of the agenda. We'll start off by focusing on the key trade flows between the UK and the EU27 and non-EU countries, before we then go into providing more detail around the Brexit scenarios that we've used in this study. Thereafter, we'll start to focus on the key trade barriers, including tariffs, tariff rate quotas, before providing more detail around non-tariff measures and just explaining a little bit around the differences between non-tariff measures and non-tariff barriers. From there, we will then look at the impact of all of those trade barriers on the beef and lamb sector as a whole. We will also be examining the impact at a farm level using Anderson's model farm, and then we'll come on to focus on how the industry could potentially mitigate some of those key issues arising from both a Brexit deal and a no-deal Brexit. Finally, we will be focusing on some other factors to take into consideration around carcass balance and the Irish border issue, before looking at specific steps that farmers can take in order to prepare for what is ahead. So moving into the first part of the webinar, looking at beef and sheep meat output and trade. For this, we've used an annual average over the 2016 to 2018 year period. And you can see coming up on your screens now the output in volume terms for the beef and veal, sheep meat, and then the combined red meat sector over that period of time. So you can see in terms of beef and veal production at the UK level, just over 914,000 tonnes per year. Sheep meat just over or almost 293,000 tonnes per annum. So combined, just over 1.2 million tonnes being produced annually over that period. In terms of trade, firstly looking at exports on the beef side going into the EU27, and you can see across the sector as a whole, the EU is accounting for the vast majority of exports from the UK. In the case of beef, exports to Ireland, the Netherlands as well are quite significant, some of that linked with processing trade flows, but also key markets such as France and Italy, for example, as well. But in terms of trade with the EU, and particularly concerning beef, it's imports where the trade is particularly significant. 94% of those imports coming in from the EU27 markets, and within that, Ireland is particularly important, accounting for about 2/3 of the imports coming in volume terms each year. If we look over on the sheep meat side of things, again, you can see that there's a substantial proportion of the exports going into the EU27 market, just over 95% of total exports. Within that, of course, France is a key market, traditionally always has been strong in terms of exports to the EU, also seeing significant increases in recent years in the German market as well. But those statistics do reveal the extent to which the UK sheep meat sector is reliant upon those exports into the EU market. And on the import side of things, they are also significant as well, particularly due to seasonal factors and imports coming in from New Zealand and Australia in particular being important at certain times of the year as well in a UK context. So moving on from that and looking at some of the post-Brexit trading scenarios that we considered in this study, first of all focusing on a Brexit deal, essentially encompassing a transition period followed by a close relationship between the UK and the rest of the EU. And by that close relationship we mean a comprehensive free trade agreement where there are no tariffs or quotas on UK to EU trade in either direction. There will be some non-tariff measures though, and I'll explain those in some more detail in a few minutes' time, because the UK of course will be outside the single market and the customs union, although there will be customs arrangements in place to address some of those issues that would arise from a non-tariff perspective. And in terms of checks on the island of Ireland, there'd be no regulatory checks on cross-border trade between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, but for trade going directly from the Republic of Ireland into GB, Dublin, cross into Holyhead, they would be subject to some of the non-tariff measures not covered in the customs arrangements. In terms of support, keeping support at the current levels for the purposes of this study, and also assuming as well that there would be no free movement of labour and the regulations would be remaining essentially the same as present. Moving onwards then into the no deal scenario, and here first of all you've got tariffs being applied to the UK and EU27 trade. We'll explain those in some more detail in a few moments' time. The EU's common external tariff of course being applied on exports from the UK into the EU27, and the UK imposing its own tariffs on imports, and they were published in March of this year. And of course then we've got the issue around tariff rate quotas or TRQs, those existing EU28 TRQs being divided out between the UK and the EU based on historic trade primarily, and we'll give some more detail on how they will be allocated later on. And we also have the introduction of a new UK tariff rate quota on beef imports at 230,000 tonnes, which of course will also play a significant role. Once again, support does remain the same as present. Of course, labour and free movement does end, and that does mean there will be issues around labour costs rising, which have been taken into consideration, and trade between the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain, so again that Dublin to Holyhead trade being subject to trade barriers. However, based on the communications that the UK government has been releasing in recent months, there would be no tariffs, of course, between Northern Ireland and GB trade, because, of course, Northern Ireland is part of the UK. So moving onwards then to look at the trade barriers, firstly focusing on tariffs, and here on your screens we've got some examples of the proposed UK import tariffs that it would apply initially for a period of up to 1 year under a no-deal Brexit context. And you can see we've divided this out between a number of different regions, the EU27, non-EU countries as a whole, and also looking at Australia, New Zealand, Brazil and the US as well. And for these tariffs, and if we take beef as examples, the UK's proposed tariffs are at a lower level to what is the case for the EU's common external tariff at the moment. And if we look at a worked example from an EU27 perspective, based on 2016 to 18 trade and the prices associated with that, for boneless beef, chilled boneless beef, it would work out to be a 37% tariff on imports coming in from the EU27. We've also listed there a selection of non-EU countries as well. Those tariffs working out a little bit less in percentage terms overall. Because of these tariffs, they have both a percentage and a fixed component. And for the imports coming in from non-EU countries, often the prices of those are higher than what's coming in from the EU at the moment. So the tariff, when it works out in a percentage level, coming in at a lower tariff level between 22 to 27% in the case of boneless beef in particular. Looking at lamb carcasses coming in, again, we've worked out the tariff from the EU27, or what would be imposed on EU27 product. Of course, the UK is proposing that its tariffs would remain the same as the EU Common External Tariff in the case of a no-deal Brexit. So that would result in a particularly high tariff in the case of lamb carcasses coming in from the EU27, equating to a 75% tariff level. And based on 2016 to 2018 trade, very little lamb carcasses trade taking place from non-EU countries. So accordingly, there's no tariff mentioned for those countries at present. And we've got examples further on down in terms of the tariffs that would be applied for boneless beef, and also for fresh and chilled sheep legs as well. And you can see overall, in terms of those imports coming in, if a tariff is applied on imports coming in from the EU27, they would result in a significant price impact overall. And moving on then to the tariffs that would be applicable on UK exports going into the EU27 in the first instance. So here, the EU27 Common External Tariff would be applied to UK trade. Again, we've got examples for a number of different beef and sheep meat products. Taking chilled boneless beef at the top, you can see that once you would calculate the tariff, both the percentage and fixed component, it would result in a 57% ad valorem equivalent rate, which of course would be a substantial impact, particularly on exports going into EU27 markets such as Italy, for example. But you can also see as well, particularly when we start to move down and look at some of the sheep meat product categories, the tariffs there are significant also. In most cases, 35% and upwards. And another key point to mention as well, the way the EU27 Common External Tariff is structured. For products where you add on more value, the percentage impact of that tariff becomes more pronounced. So tariffs on carcasses, for instance, tend to be lower than boneless cuts, for example. And you can see for frozen boneless beef cuts, there the tariff into the EU27 is at 92%. For illustrative purposes, we've also included some tariffs that would be applicable on UK trade to selected non-EU countries as well. We've got China there as an example, the US also. So if the UK is eligible to enter into these markets into the future, they're the types of, or they're the levels of tariffs that would be anticipated in that context.
So Michael, you mentioned about China on there. We've recently gained access to China at a national level. So are those the sort of tariffs that we can expect to see?
Yes, I think there's an important point to mention here in relation to China. Yes, indeed, the UK at a national level has gained access, but it's also important to point out that in terms of exports to China, and we've seen this with Ireland as well in recent years, it's also a requirement to get access at individual plant level as well. So that process is still underway in the UK as things stand at the moment. That will take some more time. In Ireland, they've recently got access at plant level in the last year or so. So there are still some hurdles there that need to be addressed in terms of being able to access the Chinese market. But yes, once that plant level as well as national level approval, which the UK has now, has been completed, those are the types of tariff levels that one would anticipate based on China's tariff schedule at present. So that gives an overview in terms of the tariff impacts. Of course, tariffs are just one aspect of the overall trade barriers. We also need to consider the tariff rate quota impacts as well. So tariff rate quotas, just to explain that, allows a specific volume, usually measured in ton terms, to be exported, whether it's into the EU28 as things stand at present. subject to a lower or often at a zero tariff level as well. As it happens in terms of the tariff rate quotas that exist into the EU market at the moment, particularly those that are available on what's called an erga omne basis, in practice open to everyone who would wish to avail of those tariff rate quotas. It's mainly for frozen products, and in the main what would be available would be subject to a tariff of about 20% as things stand in terms of the EU market. So as I've mentioned, the tariff rate quotas at the moment are for the EU28 as a whole. Of course, with the UK leaving the EU, that will mean that the existing TRQs will have to be split between the UK and the EU27. And that exercise, there was an agreement between the UK and the EU27 in the last year on how to allocate those. So they are in the process, or have been in the process of being divided out. And we can see, looking at that, just over 64,000 tonnes would be, of that existing EU28 TRQ, would be potentially available to UK exporters. And it mainly relates to frozen product, because there are specifications around those TRQs that need to be adhered to. And on the other side of that, there would be about 55,000 tonnes available for EU27 exporters going into the UK market as well. Again, subject to similar types of specifications around frozen product, for example. And if we look at UK's exports to the EU27 over the 2016 to 18 year period, what is potentially TRQ eligible, so frozen product meeting the specifications, just under 17,000 tonnes. So there would be another 114,000 tonnes there that, based on previous trade flows, they would be ineligible. Maybe some of that product would change from fresh into frozen, for instance. But it does present some issues around market access with regards to those TRQs. And in terms of the TRQ access for imports coming into the EU27, particularly under a no-deal context, we need to take account of the new 230,000 tonne beef TRQ that the UK would propose to implement in a no-deal context. That would also be available to everyone on an erga omne basis as well. So whilst the EU could theoretically get access to that and would have a total level of market access of 285,000 tonnes, it also needs to be aware that, of course, Latin American countries will have access to that 230,000 tonnes of TRQ as well. So there will be competition issues for imports coming in from the EU27 market in that context. And we also need to remember as well, in terms of Ireland, what the UK government has said would happen to trade on the island of Ireland under a no-deal context. Potentially trade routed from the Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland and across into the GB market could still happen in a no-deal Brexit context as well. And based on historical trade flows, that was just under or just over 191,000 tonnes. So that's something we just need to be mindful of in a no-deal context, and I will talk about that in a few minutes' time when we start to look at the overall trade impacts. So moving on from beef to look at sheep, of course, tariff rate quotas are also applicable in the sheep sector as well. And coming up on your screens, we've given a detailed breakdown of how the EU27 and the UK's allocation of TRQs would work out at. And a few key points to mention, and it's highlighted on your screen there, worth bearing in mind, particularly in the context of New Zealand, that significant volumes would still be coming in to the UK via a TRQ. And of course, those allocations of TRQ were based on historical trade. So there'll be still just over 114,000 tonnes of sheep meat and lamb eligible to enter into the UK via TRQ. Significant volumes as well coming in from Australia, also under a no-deal Brexit context that we need to be mindful of. And when it comes to access to the EU27 market, you can see down towards the bottom of your screen that the UK would have very small level of access to the EU27 market via a TRQ, just 378 tonnes, which of course is a very small proportion of the overall exports from the UK into the EU27 market at present. And it does highlight some of the challenges that the sheep meat sector in particular would face under a no-deal Brexit context. So moving on from there to look at the third key category of trade barriers, and that's looking at non-tariff measures. And just going to give some explanation in terms of how non-tariff measures differ slightly from non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff measures very much focused on government-imposed trade regulations on cross-border trade, include issues around customs, also include issues such as sanitary and phytosanitary issues. And important to mention at this point that some of these standards that are introduced are also important in terms of ensuring that consumers have confidence in the product that's coming in. It is meeting the required standards that are put in place at a domestic level, be that in the UK or the EU market as well. Other technical barriers to trade also fall in under this category, so issues around labelling, packaging for instance, rules around government procurement, and also rules of origin as well. So the non-tariff measures focusing very much on government imposed restrictions on trade. And on top of that, we also need to consider other factors more often associated with non-tariff barriers. And they will include private standards that could be at play in terms of domestic retailers in a given market, what specifications they would impose, and also just the general acceptance of imports coming in from third countries, be that into the UK market or be that into the EU27 market as well. But of course, complying with all of those non-tariff measures, and that was the area we particularly focused on in this study, gives rise to a whole range of costs that need to be considered. And these include both the direct charges, so relating to fees, certification, export health certificates, for example, on UK to EU trade or vice versa, inspection costs at plant levels as well, associated with physical checks at the border and sampling, those types of things also need to be taken into consideration. We've also got agents and freight forwarders fees in terms of doing the documentation, whether that's associated with customs declaration, for instance, or the clearance of products, also needs to be taken into account. And we have additional costs around administration time. And here we're particularly looking at issues around wages of shipping clerks, for instance, to undertake all of the additional documentation that would be required. Training of those shipping clerks and other staff and the new systems that would be needed are also costs that need to be taken into consideration as well. And on top of that, we've also got costs associated with delays. So not just the delays on the border, but what can happen, particularly in terms of chilled or fresh red meat products. Looking at value deterioration in that context. And if there are significant delays, that can become quite problematic very quickly. And we'll explain some more detail around that when it comes to presenting the non-tariff measure results. We've also got issues, of course, around waiting times at the borders, and particularly for driver-accompanied roll-on, roll-off loads, they can be quite significant. Estimates averaging in the industry of £1 per minute per load was the feedback based on the primary research that we undertook as part of this and other studies as well. So quite significant. And also any product that gets delayed at the border, subject to physical checks and particularly subject to sampling, where delays of several days can take place, it will be subject to demurrage fees that the port would charge for a container, for instance, taking up space on port side. And we've also seen a lot of issues over the last few months as well about stocks and storage. Storage costs and storage is a key issue now across the UK, as some organisations and companies have been preparing and building up the stocks in case of a no-deal Brexit taking place. So there are also additional costs that we need to consider as part of this overall assessment. And overall for this study, approximately 30 different cost categories have been taken into account in terms of quantifying the overall costs of NTMs and their impact on trading businesses in the beef and sheep meat sectors. So moving on from that and then starting to look at NTM cost estimates and the presentation of the results from this study, and there's more detailed information available, particularly in chapter 6 of the report, which underpins this study. And in terms of how we calculated the NTM costs, we firstly looked at checked loads, what could be called almost the unlucky load that is subject to the full range of checks and sampling, whether that's imposed by DEFRA or whether it's imposed by the HMRC, because there are distinct categories of checks that take place. And then from there, once we quantified the full potential costs that could take place across various Brexit scenarios, we then started to apply probability to those estimates. So if we take red meat or take beef, for instance, the default physical check rate at the moment, according to EU's official controls and what will be transposed into UK law initially, as well, that default check rate would be at a 20% level. However, some countries have better levels of access than that. Canada, for instance, under the CETA deal for beef, would be subject to 10% physical check levels. And taking New Zealand in the case of lamb, it is subject to a physical check rate of just 1%. And it's for this reason that we introduced an additional scenario in our assessment of NTM costs. We introduced a low scenario which depicted or estimated the potential minimum of non-tariff measure costs that the UK would face as a third country post-Brexit. So that physical check rate that New Zealand enjoys, for instance, 1% as opposed to the default 20% physical check rate, was assumed under the probability-based estimates in that scenario. Of course, in order to avail of that, it is very important to point out that standards would need to remain very closely aligned between the UK and the EU, as is the case between New Zealand and the EU as things stand at present. So based on that, that was the basis for calculating the NTM costs in this study. We would point out that it's important to take both the check loads and the probability-based estimates into consideration, because some businesses will be unlucky enough to have a load subject to the full range of checks that could take place, whereas some of the larger organisations in particular, dispatching 100 or more loads over the course of a year, might be subject to proportionately lower rates of checks, and therefore the probability-based estimates potentially more applicable in that context. So what does all of this mean in practice? Here we're just depicting the typical meat import process from a third country. Brazil is being used in this context into the UK as part of the EU28 as things stand at the moment. And what we've done, as you'll see on the screens, we've set out a number of key stakeholders, particularly from a UK perspective, that would be involved in this process, and then identifying the regulatory checks that would take place. Firstly, starting out months ahead of the actual shipment, then looking at what happens weeks or days ahead of the shipment, what takes place upon arrival into UK, and there are also issues post-clearance and post-entry into the UK that need to be taken into consideration as well. So if we look first of all months ahead in terms of what happens, importer will typically apply for a license to import from a third country into the UK or EU27 market. That will mean that they'll need to apply for licenses, involve the Rural Payments Agency within that, get securities, for instance, set up as well, and ensure that they have the required confirmations that trade can take place. And also in terms of the competent authority or port health authority level, important that where the product is being imported from, if it's Brazil in this case, that both the country itself but also the individual plant has received approval. To date, that has been undertaken, of course, at an EU level. And then moving on from that, looking at weeks and days ahead of the shipments, getting the products ready for shipments. Of course, there's going to be veterinary checks that will need to take place, and arising from that, the appropriate veterinary health certification will be required from the exporters. And there'll also be processes that will need to be undertaken in terms of getting CVED documents compiled correctly, registering the information via traces, or in the future UK system that will be akin to the traces system operating at EU level. And then from there, ensuring that the required documentation has been sent to the agent, and the appropriate authorities, in the UK case, the HMRC for instance, also being informed as well. So a number of different additional steps that need to be undertaken and planned in advance. And then arising from that, once the product arrives in the UK, you've also got a number of additional checks that could take place at the border. Firstly, documentary and identity checks. All of the loads of products of animal origin will be subject to those. And then from there, a proportion would be subject to physical checks. The default rate, as I've mentioned, is 20%. And a subset of that will also be subject to sampling. And that could potentially result in several days' delays at the border. So all of those processes need to be undertaken. Any relevant checks or sampling, if the product is selected for sampling, will need to be undertaken at that point. And it's only when all of those different steps in the process have been undertaken, the HMRC is satisfied that any duties applicable have been paid, it's only at that point will the goods be entered into free circulation into the UK in this context, or into the EU27 market as well. And then upon entry into the market, we also need to consider other steps that just need to be taken into account as well, in terms of keeping the appropriate records, returning any securities or licenses, fees, etc., to the rural payments agencies as well. So that just gives a picture in terms of the number of additional steps that would need to be taken versus present, where the UK product can be shipped into an EU27 market, be that France, using essentially the same process as what would happen shipping a product from Midlands of the UK down into Cornwall, for instance. So as a third country trading with the EU post-Brexit, potentially looking at 30 or more additional steps that will need to be undertaken as part of the regulatory process.
So there's a lot of information to take in there around non-tariff measures and a lot of key points, but what would you say are those key focuses that you would pull out from this study?
I think in terms of non-tariff measures overall, I think a key focus has to be on the sanitary and phytosanitary regulations, particularly for beef and sheep meat as products of animal origin. They have a significant impact. Product has to be checked at the border, and those delays can give rise to significant levels of value deterioration, particularly when you look at chilled and fresh product as well. And that has a significant impact when we come to assessing the non-tariff measure costs. And I think with all of this as well, we need to bear in mind, particularly for SMEs who are trading into the EU at present, very little regulation that needs to be adhered to. All of these additional steps in the future will place, of course, a significant burden on SMEs in particular. Larger scale enterprises will have more capacity, likely to be exporting into other non-EU markets as well. So we'll have some more familiarity with some of these steps versus some of the SMEs that trade with the EU only. So I think that's an important point that needs to be taken into consideration as part of all of this as well. And I think there's some other points, I think we'll come on to it in a moment's time when we look at the actual NTM costs that I think we'll take into account as well in this context. And I think just in terms of some of those key points around beef and sheep meat NTM costs, a lot of the focus tends to be on converting the NTM costs into an ad valorem equivalent. I think it's also important to take into account what the potential costs are on a cost per tonne basis as well, because for different products prices can change quite significantly. So taking an AV level now might not be appropriate in 6 to 12 months time when those prices have changed, particularly when we look at the value deterioration considerations. In addition to that, looking at the results of this study as a whole, NTM costs for UK into EU27 market slightly higher than for third country to UK trade, and that's primarily due to higher prices from that product coming in to the UK from those non-EU markets, high-end steak products for instance, versus what's taking place from the UK into the EU, which of course includes some Carcass product, lower value product as well. And in terms of the check load NTM costs, they are quite substantial, particularly for fresh product, frequently surpassing 25%, particularly under a no deal context. And value deterioration, as I've mentioned, that's a key aspect of that. Probably 80%, sometimes more, in terms of the overall no deal costs in the context of check loads. Even under a deal, it can be quite significant as well, frequently within the 40 to 60% range in terms of those check loads costs. Of course, that's not as much of a feature, value deterioration, for frozen product, but even in that context, NTM costs are quite significant for check loads, ranging from 2 to 11% overall, and under a Brexit deal scenario, 5 to 6%, which in the context of profit margins within the industry, that is significant as well. And in terms of probability, when we start to look at it, you'll see that roll costs, roll-on, roll-off costs, slightly lower than some of the low, lift-on, off costs. This is primarily due, in the study we had differences in terms of load weights. Row 18 tonnes per load, low was at 14 tonnes per load. So when you apply the NTM costs to that smaller load, they become more in percentage terms overall. So just worth bearing that in mind. And as I've mentioned, SMEs are of most concern in terms of experience with dispatching loads, but also in terms of availing of authorised economic operator status, which can help with some of the customs aspects of NTM measures, not applicable as things stand at present in terms of sanitary and phytosanitary issues. But SMEs are less likely to have availed of that status. So again, there will be more of an impact when it comes to the regulatory authorities assessing the risk that they would see it potentially associated with some of those SMEs and selecting their loads for regulatory checks. So when we move on then to look at the probability-based NTM costs, so here we're taking account of factors such as 20% physical check rate in the case of a no deal scenario, 10% in the case of a deal scenario, and a deal in this context is denoted by the red dots as you will see in the chart on your screens. And we've also added the low scenario as well, so New Zealand type rates of physical checks and sampling, for instance. And you can see, based on the NTM cost estimates expressed in ad valorem equivalent here for UK to EU27 shipments, under a deal scenario for most products, the ad valorem equivalent cost is in or around the 2% level. And you can also see as well, in terms of the range depicted by the grey shaded columnar bars in the chart, that can vary quite a lot, particularly when we look at the fresh or chilled product. If we take beef carcasses, for instance, you can see that in some cases projected NTM costs, probability based, go to the 8% level. And that just indicates the difference when we're looking at chilled product versus some of the frozen product, where the range from low to high is not quite as significant. It just shows some of the issues that could take place in a post-Brexit context for that chilled product trade, which of course is very prevalent as things stand at the moment. And I think one other point, and I think it links into the question that we've just had around key points to take away from this, and it shows in terms of these estimates here that if the UK and the EU27 remain closely aligned or harmonised in terms of the standards, then the scope for decreasing significantly the impact of the NTM costs is something that can take place. If the UK starts to diverge significantly from the EU in the future, then it's more likely that the default levels of checks will start to take place, and therefore the impact of the non-tariff measure costs will be proportionately more into the future. So moving on from that, and we've just depicted on the bottom of the screen as well, just to show the different prices which we've based our calculations on. And you can see for some product, particularly the offal over on the right hand side of your screen, because that product has a lower value, when it comes to calculating the NTM costs as a proportion of that, it generally works out to be at a higher level. And I think this links into the point around not just considering ad valorem equivalent costs, but it's also important to consider cost per tonne as well. And in the report, we've gone into detail in terms of the projected NTM costs on a per tonne basis and also on a per load basis as well. So I would encourage listeners to consult the report on those estimates. So bringing all of this together then, what does it mean for beef and sheep meat sector overall? And coming up on your screens here now, we've got the projected impacts focusing on volumes under a Brexit deal context. And you can see overall we've got it segmented out for both beef and sheep meat and then combined both sectors as a whole. The impact of Brexit, if there is a deal, is relatively small impact overall. Yes, exports will decrease into the EU27 market, primarily due to those non-tariff measure costs being applicable, but the overall impact is just more than 1% in terms of those overall exports. And similarly for imports coming in from the EU, again some slight decreases taking place, primarily linked with those non-tariff measure costs. And with the non-EU markets, relatively little change, negligible change taking place. And would just point out in the context, these projections that have been undertaken, it's very much 9 to 12 months post Brexit. So whether that's a deal or a no deal, that's the timescale that we're looking at. So overall, minimal changes for offal as well. We haven't shown the estimates on the screen, but we have looked at this as well. Minimal changes projected within the offal sector as well. However, when we come to a no deal, the impact is quite a bit more substantial, particularly when we look at the sheep meat sector. So if we look at exports of sheep meat going into the EU27 market, because there's very little access via TRQ into that market, and because tariffs are being applied, then trade to the EU27 essentially collapses almost. And of course that has a major impact on the overall performance of the sector as a whole. That major market, sometimes exports to the EU can account for anywhere between 25 even up to 40%, averaging at about 33% of the lamb crop each year being exported into the EU market. If that market is no longer available, it will have a substantial impact, as is the case here in terms of the impact on UK production. Yes, there might be scope to decrease some of the imports. Obviously, imports coming in from the EU27 will also be subject to similar levels of tariffs, so there will be a significant impact there in terms of trade. And if we look across to the beef sector overall, again, we're seeing trade with the EU decrease quite significantly, not by quite as much as is in the case of sheep meat, because there is some more levels of access via TRQ into the EU market, but still a substantial decrease in exports taking place overall. And of course, imports coming in as well, subject to major impact. Even if the EU countries can still gain access to that 230,000 tonnes of a TRQ, they will be competing with non-EU countries for that. And of course, non-EU countries, particularly if we take the likes of Brazil, for instance, a lot lower price, a lot more competitive versus importers from the EU27. So we would anticipate non-EU imports in a no-deal context rising substantially by just over 1,300% based on these estimates. So overall, what does that mean for trade when we look at exports? 92.5% decline on exports into the EU27 market is projected under a Brexit no-deal context. Expect falls, of course, on imports from the EU as well, and non-EU imports will compensate for a significant proportion of that particularly in beef. But overall, in terms of trade with the EU, that will be almost wiped out under a no-deal Brexit context. And in terms of the sheep meat sector, we're particularly seeing major impacts there. Production down by estimated 9%. And whilst consumption would increase because prices will be down, it still won't compensate for the overall impact of a no-deal Brexit. So when we start to look at that in terms of adding price and overall output considerations to that, for beef prices under a Brexit deal, anticipating relatively little change, just a 1% fall under a Brexit deal context. In a no deal, the UK of course is not self-sufficient with regards to beef production. A 4% reduction in prices is being projected because of course the TRQ will only be applied up to a certain level. After that there will be some protection domestically in the UK. I think we need to point out here a key caveat within that though is trade between the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland and onwards into GB. What happens there during the study, that was an issue. There were a lot of questions around that. It wasn't possible to quantify that. If significant trade comes via that route in the future, then there could be scope for more significant price declines than what has been mentioned in these projections. We'll talk about that in more detail in a few minutes' time. Sheep meat, again, more pronounced price declines under a Brexit deal scenario, about 3%. But of course, that's substantially less than what could happen under a no deal, where price drops in the region of 24% are projected, because of course, a key market for the UK sheep meat sector would be closed off in that context. So what does all of this mean in terms of a farm gate level impact for domestically produced beef and sheep meat? Study has given projections in comparison with the baseline using 2017 estimates in this context. What would happen under a Brexit deal and no deal scenario for beef and sheep meat? And you can see in terms of the overall monetary impact on sales under a Brexit deal scenario, relatively small impact, particularly in the case of beef, slightly more pronounced for the sheep meat sector, but it is of course the no deal is where the most substantial impact will take place, particularly looking at sheep meat. Output from the sector in monetary terms down by almost 31%, and across beef and sheep meat as a whole an almost 12% decline in sales taking place. So that gives an overall picture, the relatively small change that would take place under a Brexit deal scenario, but no deal would be a substantial cost to the industry, close on 490 million in monetary terms looking at output. And what does all this mean then for at a farm level? To provide some calculations in this regard, we're using Anderson's Meadow Farm model. Anderson's is a series of model farms that it uses to calculate the impacts of policy and trade policy changes in UK agriculture. And this farm, it is a notional farm, 154 hectares based in the Midlands of England. Most of the land is owned. There's 40 hectares in a farm business tenancy as well. It has a range of different enterprises. Beef, suckler cow herd, about 60 cows, finished bull beef business as well, about 35 head of cattle within that, and a 500 ewe breeding flock as well. And in terms of the farm's performance, and I would just point out this is a notional farm, it's not based on any one individual farm's information, but it's based on the collective experience of Anderson's consultants when speaking with farmers on a day-to-day basis. So looking at the projections for 2019-2020, you can see livestock is projected at £1,259 per hectare overall, and you can see going down towards the margin from production. This farm is making a loss if we just look at the production output and associated costs alone. It is only when support is added to that farms such as this start to generate a surplus. In the case of Meadow Farm, it's at £93 per hectare for 2019-2020 period. So if we look at the Brexit impacts that we've spoken about being applied to this farm, firstly under a Brexit deal context, you can see there are some declines in terms of output because slight decreases in beef prices, some decreases in sheep meat prices taking place as well. So a slight deterioration in performance overall, and you can see a slightly more pronounced loss from production of £173 per hectare. But once again, we're keeping support at the same levels. So this farm still generates a surplus in a Brexit deal context of £68 per hectare. Performance not quite as good under the baseline budgetary projections. But under no deal, of course, this impact becomes much more pronounced. Significant decreases taking place within the sheep meat sector, in particular with regards to price, and that in turn drives a more substantial loss of from production, equating to about £286 per hectare in this context. So even if support is kept at the same level, this farm starts to generate a loss. And if we look at that across the farm as a whole under a no deal context, it's almost £7,000 loss that's being generated. So key questions for farms such as this, and I think with one eye on the future as well with regards to support payments, you can see farms such as this are heavily reliant on support. What happens in terms of direct payments in the future, if the levels of support go down over the longer term, it will give rise to key questions for farms such as this as to what they will do in the future. So I think important that farms start to plan now as well to look at the range of scenarios that could happen and what would be the impact of a significant decrease in support levels for individual businesses. I think it's important to plan for that into the future, because there are a range of different scenarios that could happen, and I think it's prudent just to do the homework at this stage in relation to that. Moving on then just to look at a few additional issues. Firstly, focusing on carcass balance implications under a no-deal scenario. We've done quite a bit of research around this, and it is illustrated, I believe, in chapter 8 in the report. In terms of beef, relatively small impacts, because of course the UK is not self-sufficient in beef production, and what was previously exported to the EU could be consumed domestically, albeit in some cases there might be lower prices, particularly the higher value hindquarter cuts that have been exported to the likes of Italy in the past that will be consumed domestically in the UK, but potentially some lower prices associated with that. But the big issue in relation to carcass balance implications, of course, is with sheep meat. As I've mentioned, approximately 1/3 of the UK lamb crop each year is exported into the EU market. And if we look in terms of a net trade position, so exports going out into the EU27 minus any imports for that given commodity code that has been coming in from the EU in the past, the UK would have a net trade surplus with the EU of almost 73,000 tonnes per annum, and carcasses in particular are important, almost 51,000 tonnes of that. So if we look at carcasses as the area, as a risk area, and look at what proportion of those carcasses could potentially be consumed domestically in the UK, it's typically the legs of lamb, potentially the shoulder cuts as well, that could be used domestically. And that would equate in a typical R3 carcass of just under 47%. So that would still leave a substantial tonnage, just over 27,164 tonnes, that would need to find a market outlet. And when you equate that back into a number of lambs in equivalent, it's just over 2.5 million lambs, which equates to about 18% of the UK lamb crop. So that gives an indication of the amount of exposure that could take place in a no-deal context. And added to that, there are other cuts that are exported into the EU market as well. Short 4 quarters, so just over 5,100 tonnes net trade surplus with the EU there. That could be problematic potentially as well for almost 600,000 lambs. So taking those areas, or those two key areas overall, we're looking at exposure, significant risks around just over 3 million lambs or sheep being affected each year. And that equates to about 22% of the overall annual kill in the UK. So that is the risk factor under a no-deal situation. What can be done to address that? Yes, there can be scope in some areas to substitute imports coming in. I think important to point out though the role of seasonality in this context. That will create some difficulties in the extent to which import substitution can take place. I think there are also opportunities though to look at ways in which the shelf life of UK lamb could be extended so that it does start to gain a greater share of the domestic market in the UK. And of course, looking to the longer term as well, opportunities to open up new markets. I think it's important to prioritise those, but we do need to be mindful that distance is going to be a major issue in this context. Exporting from Wales, for instance, into Paris, that's about 500 miles. If you're exporting from Wales across into Middle East market, for instance, that is 4,000 miles of a distance. So that is a hurdle that needs to be considered. And in terms of this study, we very much looked at the 9 to 12 months post-Brexit event and what would take place. Building markets, particularly in these international markets, also takes time to build up as well, and that needs to be factored into consideration. One other issue, I've alluded to it a couple of times today already, it's in relation to the border situation with Ireland. And just to recap on what we're calling the backstop trilemma. And of course, in this context, and we're hearing a lot about it in the news at the moment, 3 mutually incompatible promises have essentially been made over the course of Brexit. First of those, the UK has committed to leaving the single market and the customs union. At the same time, guarantees have also been given in the context of Northern Ireland to GB trade that there would be no checks on trade across the Irish Sea, because of course Northern Ireland is part of the UK. And in addition to that, an additional promise has been made by both the UK and the EU in the Brexit negotiations that there would be no hard border on the island of Ireland as a result of Brexit. So if we start to look at some of those areas, firstly, considering that the UK will be leaving the single market and the customs union, yet there'll be no checks across the Irish Sea on GB and Northern Ireland trade, that would then result in a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, which of course breaks the UK's and the EU's commitments in the first round of negotiations going back to November 2017. And if we look at then, with there being no hard border on the island of Ireland, yet no checks across the Irish Sea, that would essentially mean that the UK would be staying in the single market. Of course, breaking the UK government's red line on that front. And that's been very much the focus of this UK-wide backstop that we've been hearing about over recent months, which of course is attracting a lot of debate and controversy as well. And if we look at the other aspect of the backstop trilemma, no hard border in the island of Ireland, yet the UK leaving the single market and customs union, well, that then would mean that there would be checks on Irish Sea trade, Great Britain across into Northern Ireland, and that of course being unacceptable to the DUP, and we've heard a lot about that recently. And in terms of finding a solution that addresses all of these issues, I think if there was a solution to have been found to that, it would have been found by now, and I think it's failed everyone thus far. And in that context, some have mentioned about technology and its potential to solve customs issues. Yes, technology certainly has a role to play, but it won't obviate the need for sanitary and phytosanitary checks, and particularly those physical checks, for instance, that are needed on the border for agri-food products. And I think that captures the essence really of the problems with regards to post-Brexit trade between Ireland and the UK in particular. The UK government is saying it's not going to impose any checks on product coming across from Ireland. Then there is the potential that product moves from Ireland across into Northern Ireland and eventually ends up finding its way into the GB market, which of course in a no-deal scenario will mean significant additional volumes coming into the UK market, and that could lead to scope for more pronounced price declines versus what has been mentioned in this study. So I think important to point out that there are issues associated with that need to be factored into consideration. Few other points just going to make around frictionless trade and transition. We'll just make the point in terms of trade, even in an intra-EU context at the moment, there are some frictions that do take place there. Very small in terms of beef and sheep meat. But if we look at areas like live animals, for instance, there are controls that take place, and within intra-EU trade, they result in an ad valorem equivalent NTM costs of about 2 to 3%. And there are also some differences that can take place within EU countries in terms of rules, but they're considered quite rare, particularly in the context of the beef and sheep industry. And in terms of looking at the post-Brexit situation and achieving frictionless trade, well, we don't believe it will be possible if the UK is leaving the single market and customs union to achieve as frictionless trade as the status quo. Yes, technology has a role to play in helping to reduce the impact, particularly around e-certification. Countries such as New Zealand are progressing on that front. But in terms of obviating the need for checks on the border, particularly physical checks for beef and sheep meat, for instance, then according to industry experts, as things stand, we're more than a decade away from that at the moment. So still a significant amount of time needed in order to obviate those border-related checks. And in terms of a transition period and what the industry believes would be required, this is in the context of a Brexit deal. The view is 2 to 3 years would be needed, particularly looking at the likes of beef, where there are longer production cycles. A longer transition period would be preferred. And some believe that if there are changes that can be introduced within that time period, if they're seamless and easy to implement, then they should be brought forward. But an important point that industry makes in this context is it's important to look at the operational level impact of these changes. Sometimes there is a temptation to look at the policy level only. It needs to be aligned at the operational level as well, otherwise that can create some unexpected issues into the future. So looking at some overall conclusions from this study, we can see relatively small impact under a Brexit deal scenario, but there is potential for major upheaval under a no deal when we take tariffs, non-tariff measures into consideration in particular. We've mentioned a number of times about the border arrangements, particularly those regarding no hard border on the island of Ireland. They are of concern. They could have a significant impact on post-Brexit trade as well, of course. And in terms of looking at markets in non-EU countries, yes, there are opportunities to grow those, but they are insufficient to replace the EU market post-Brexit, particularly over the time period that we've looked at, 9 to 12 months following a Brexit event. Longer term, there may be some opportunities, but they are growing from very much a low base. And in terms of those sanitary and phytosanitary issues and the value deterioration issues linked with that, they very much dominate the non-tariff measure costs, and is something that the industry as a whole will need to focus on in a post-Brexit context, and particularly the impact of those NTM costs on SMEs, as we mentioned, less likely to avail of authorised economic operator status, lower volumes traded, not as experienced in trading as well in many cases, particularly with the additional paperwork that's required. So that is a significant risk area. And coming back then to at a farm level what farmers can do, because there is a lot happening in the policy environment generally, but what actions can be taken at a farm level to address some of the issues. And a while back, the AHDB, in collaboration with Anderson's, did look at the characteristics of top performers on UK farms and what they're doing different versus the others and what's leading to their superior performance. And here there's 8 different areas of focus, or 8 different areas where there's scope for actions for farms to take. And one of those, minimising overhead costs, which we've seen particularly over the last decade, accounts for a substantial proportion of the variation in costs between those best performers and poor performing farms. Better performing farms also very good in terms of setting goals and budgets and benchmarking themselves with others, not just within their industry but also other industries as well. Beef and sheep meat sector, for instance, might have lessons to learn in terms of maximising grassland utilisation efficiency from other sectors, such as dairy, for instance. So important to take those lessons from other sectors. Best farms also tend to be more focused on the market and meeting market needs, understanding the market needs, not just of consumers but also of their direct customers within the supply chain as well. And they have a good handle of the details overall within their business and being able to manage those effectively. At the same time, they do have the flexibility to adapt. They're looking to change, looking at opportunities for innovation into the future as well. So I think flexibility around that, particularly in the policy environment we're facing, will be important. And those better performing farms are good in terms of people management as well. Particularly as some farms have got larger, there is a need in terms of people management. It's not just about being able to manage stock effectively, it's also being important to manage the people who in turn manage those stock, and that's a different skill set that is required as well. And linked with some of that, there is the opportunity around specialisation. That could be some of the people that you employ or some of the people that you bring into your business, that they focus on what they're really good at, so you get optimum performance in terms of stock management, for example, and farm management overall. And I think a key message in the context of all of this is that farmers need to continually focus on what you can control individually at a farm level. The industry has been through numerous crises in recent decades, and those who've come through those crises best tend to perform very well in relation to those 8 factors listed above. So I think for farms, it's important to identify actions that you can take in that context. And in terms of the volatile environment that we're facing now and the diverse range of scenarios that could come to pass in a few months' time, I think it's important for farmers to keep paying attention to what's happening at a policy level in terms of trade policy, in terms of agricultural policy as well, and how support might change in the future. And that farmers plan in terms of the range of scenarios that could take place, so that when decisions get made or when a specific scenario starts to come to pass, farmers at least know the direction of actions that they need to take in order to ensure that they can come through those challenges as best as possible. Farmers should resist any temptation to not do anything at this point in time, because when that change does take place, I think it's important to have an action plan, to know what to do, what direction to travel, and not be looking for information at that point in time. I think that is crucial. So I think that concludes in terms of the key findings from the study. Just going to hand back to Luke to conclude today.
Thank you very much, Michael. There's lots of information in there, and it's really key, especially in this uncertain times, to really be paying attention to as much as possible and adapt those plans to businesses. So thank you for clicking on this webinar and watching it. For more information, please visit the AHDB website. We've got lots of impact assessments of how Brexit will potentially affect agriculture. Lots of news around that as well. You can see the report there on the left-hand side that we've been talking about today. That's available on the website, and we've also done various articles kind of breaking it down into bite-sized chunks to try and ease with the interpretation of that information. In terms of the characteristics, that report's on the right hand side of your screen. That looks at a lot more detail under those characteristics and some specific scenarios for individual sectors. The market specialist policy team is on there, so you've got a few names to associate this kind of material with. So if you have any questions or just want to get in contact with us for some pieces of information, please do so. You can contact us either individually through the AHDB switchboard number there at the bottom of your screens, or send your questions through to brexit.questions@ahdb.org.uk. So it just leaves me to say thank you again for listening to this webinar. Thank you again to Michael for your work on the report and this session. All the best in the future.